Well, it's good to see everybody out this morning. If you want to take out your Bible and turn to 1 Samuel 17, we're going to spend a lot of time there this morning, and we're going to be talking about a very familiar story, and that's the story of the account of the battle David had with Goliath. So, very familiar story, but I want to spend a few minutes talking about that and seeing some applications that we can make. I'll have all the verses on the screen, but it may be easier for you to follow along. So we'll spend a few minutes going through 1 Samuel 17. We'll talk about what happened and kind of set the scene, and then we'll try to make applications. But the title of the lesson is "They're Not a Cause," and hopefully as we get through, you'll see why I titled the lesson that way. I wanted to start before we really dive in to show you a couple pictures of what the land looks like. This may not be the best picture. I've got another one. But it's sort of labeled for you there, where you can kind of see where the Philistines were camped and where the Israelites were camped. So kind of, there's a valley and then there's a little rise on either side, and the Philistines were on one side, the Israelites were on the other side. And maybe this is a better picture, this one. So you can kind of see the valley in the middle, and you can see where they were camped, and you can kind of picture where this took place. And notice there's an arrow there pointing to a dry creek bed, which no doubt that probably is where David picked up the stones we're going to talk about that he ended up using to killing Goliath. And then this road here is where the Philistines fled down that road after David defeated Goliath. And the Israelites kind of joined in and chased them. But that's a modern day picture, so maybe that kind of helps us get our frame of mind where this took place. Notice the verses down here, 1 Samuel 17, beginning at verse 1, it says, "The Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah and Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley in between them." All right, so that's what we're looking at. And this is a well-known location to this day. And so look at that picture, kind of get that in your mind as we talk about these armies on either side drawing up in battle array, ready to fight. And so David met Goliath down there in between those two mountains. All right, as we continue on in the text, in 1 Samuel 17, beginning at verse 4, it says, "A champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had a bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him." So I want to spend just a minute talking about this Philistine champion, Goliath. Goliath was a very large man. I know that's been talked about a lot in the past. But it says he was 6 cubits in a span. A cubit, in modern times would be between the elbow, or from the elbow to the tip of the finger, which would be about 18 inches. Maybe, everybody's a little bit different, so maybe give or take some. But if you just say it was between 18 and 20 inches, and then a span would be about half of that. A span, they would say between your pinky and your thumb, that'd be about a span, 9 or 10 inches. Everybody's might be a little bit different. But 6 cubits in a span, if I did my math right, on the low end, Goliath would have been 9 feet, 9 inches tall. And on the high end, he would have been 10 feet, 10 inches tall. Goliath was a big man, very large man. And that's not an exaggeration. There's been some people maybe that have tried to attack the Bible and say, "Oh, this is exaggeration. He was tall, but the Bible is trying to paint this picture like he was bigger than he actually was." No, that's a real height, and he was a big man. I looked up in modern times the world's tallest man, the Guinness Book of World Records, world's tallest man. His name was Robert Wadlow, and he was 8 feet 11 inches tall, and he was still growing at the time that he died at 22 years old in 1940. He had a condition where he had abnormal amounts of human growth hormone, but he was big. I mean, he was really big. I was telling Kristen last night, when that Robert Wadlow fellow was 1 year old, he weighed 45 pounds and he was 3.5 feet tall. So he was big. He was growing, and he was growing at the time that he passed away at 22. No doubt he probably would have continued growing, and he would have been over 9 feet tall, but it said he passed away in 1940. But Goliath was even bigger than that. He was a really big man. He obviously was a strong man. This coat of mail that he wore, it says the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And I looked that up, and it said that's roughly 125 pounds. And so we're not talking about his helmet or any of the other gear that he wore on his feet or his legs or what he carried. Just his coat of mail was another 125 pounds, the armor that he wore. So he was obviously a big man, very intimidating. If he walked out to challenge you, you'd probably hesitate to go fight Goliath. He was a big guy. And the army of Israel was afraid of him. And when they saw this 10-foot tall fellow stand before them, they didn't want to react either. As the verses go on, in 1 Samuel 17, verse 10, said, the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. So really think about that. Down in this valley here, the armies are camped on either side. Goliath walked out there every day for 40 days, both morning and evening. You can just imagine him going out there shouting, come fight me. Somebody come and fight me. I'm defying the armies of God. Somebody come and fight me. And Israel just stood there and looked at him. They were just afraid. And nobody wanted to go fight him. After 40 days of being challenged, nobody responded. The text goes on, if you skip down to verse 31, it says, now when the words of, hold on a second, I might have skipped some here. No, I guess I'm missing a slide. David was a young shepherd boy, and he was sent by his father Jesse to go and take provisions to his brothers who were down there with the army. And when he saw the circumstances, he said, well, I'll go fight. And so verse 31 says, when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, King Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, because of Goliath. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. So here comes David, he's a young teenager probably, and he goes down there and he says, well, I'll go fight this guy. You got the army standing there unwilling to fight, and a little shepherd boy shows up and says, no problem, I'll go fight him. In verses 36 and 37, David told Saul, your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So Saul's initial response was to object. He considered putting David out there in front of Goliath like throwing a lamb to the slaughter. He's not going to make it. Goliath will absolutely kill him, and it won't even be a contest. But David talked about his prowess in killing a lion and a bear to protect his sheep. He says, I've done this before. I've fought creatures before, a lion and a bear, and I was able to beat them. And he said, the Lord delivered me from both of them, and he will deliver this Philistine into my hand. David knew that he could defeat Goliath because he had faith in God. It's interesting. You remember David refused Saul's armor. Saul tried to give him some armor, and David said, I haven't tested it, and so I can't wear it. And so instead, what he did was, he went down to the creek, and he picked out 5 smooth stones, and he had a sling, and he took that to go fight Goliath. And then Goliath made fun of him. You can imagine this big warrior, and a little boy walks out, like, this is the best that you have. You sent a little child out here to fight me. And Goliath told him he was going to kill him. In verses 48 to 51, it said, so it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Then David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone. And he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. So with the help of God, David killed this giant. He did what he was good at. He took his slingshot and he took a stone and he killed Goliath with it. And then he took Goliath's sword and cut his head off with his own sword. The next couple of verses 52 to 54, It says, "Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent." All right, so the rout of the Philistines was on. David's prowess of a warrior was established, and David's victory encouraged the rest of the army to fight. And after they saw David beat Goliath, then they all joined in and they chased him down that road that we saw on that picture. All right, so we kind of went through that quick, but I wanted to take a few minutes to make sure we've got the story in our mind. That story thrills the heart of children. You know, they love to hear that story of small boy David killing the giant Goliath. But it also encourages God's people today. And so what I want to do now is take a look at a few lessons that I think we can learn from this story and ask the question, is there not a cause? I think the first thing we can learn from the story is that fear can be paralyzing. When people are afraid, it can cause them to not act. Even well-trained warriors like those who were in the Israelite army. When you got this warrior, this mighty warrior, who is strolling out in front of you for 40 days, both morning and night, and just challenging you to come fight, and the men of Israel stood there and did nothing because they were afraid. They were just afraid of him. They didn't want to go out there. They knew for sure if they walked out there, they were going to be killed. Goliath would kill them. The fight would be over before it hardly even got started. And so fear just paralyzed them. And so they didn't act at all. Back to a couple verses in 1 Samuel 17, and they're really similar. Verse 11 says, "Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine. They were dismayed and greatly afraid." We can probably read that and not really contemplate what it truly meant. I mean, they were scared to death. I don't know how to put it in any other words. They were not at all wanting to go out there and fight Goliath. In verse 24, it says, "All the men of Israel, when they saw Goliath, they fled from him. They were dreadfully afraid." You couldn't get them to go out there and fight Goliath for nothing. It seems like they were that afraid. It paralyzed them. And so the army of Israel's fear and weakness of faith prevented them from meeting the challenge. Only after they saw David go out there and show courage as a shepherd boy and defeat the giant, then they were willing to fight. So today, we don't have a 10-foot tall warrior standing before us and challenging us. We don't have a man like Goliath coming out and saying, "Hey, come out here and fight me every day." We don't have that today. But what we do have is spiritual enemies that exist today. There are people today that are standing up against you and standing up against me and standing against God. And maybe they're challenging us. Maybe they present themselves to us, and as they do that, maybe we're afraid and we're sort of debilitated and we don't move. We just freeze up with fear, just like the army of Israel did. And so one application I think we can learn is that we can't fear the opponents of our faith. We can't be so afraid of them that we do nothing, because God is greater than them. David knew that going into the fight. That's true in regard to spiritual enemies. You know, there's a lot of enemies out there. Error, worldliness. One example I thought of was maybe there's a person who is some scientist, and they start presenting their theory on why they believe that God doesn't exist, or how this world came to be. This person is well educated. They've got letters behind their name, and so they're using words that I can't hardly even say or understand, and they start presenting an argument to me about why God doesn't exist, and so I'm afraid to answer them. I'm going to sound silly. I can't even understand the words they're saying, and here I'm supposed to articulate argument to them, and so I'm afraid, so I just don't say anything. Fear causes us to be paralyzed sometimes, and so we shy away from talking to people about God. Maybe you're at work and somebody asks you, "Hey, do you go to church? Are you a Christian maybe?" And we say, I'm gonna look real weird if I start telling them, not only do I go, but I try to go every week. And I try to live right. And they're going, "Well, you're really weird then." And that's going to cause us to be afraid. Maybe we don't want to talk about that because we don't want to stand out and be different. And again, that's different from Goliath standing out in front of Israel, but I would just submit to you that fear causes us to be paralyzed against spiritual enemies even today. In 1 John 4, beginning at verse 4, the Apostle John says, "You are of God, little children, and have overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. They are of the world, therefore they speak as of the world, and the world hears them. We are of God. He who knows God hears us. He who is not of God does not hear us. By this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. So the Apostle John says, you're of God, and God is on your side. And if God is on your side and you're defending the truth is going to win out. So I may look silly as I talk to somebody, but if I'm telling them the truth's going to win out. So it doesn't matter how silly I look. It doesn't matter who stands up and tries to oppose God. They're going to lose in the end. And so if we go into it with that mindset, it doesn't matter. If you're of God, then it says, he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. So what have I got to lose? And so that would be true regarding spiritual enemies. That'd also be true regarding people who may seek to do us harm. I don't know that any of us have had anybody try to attack us or kill us because we're a Christian, but that may come. I don't know. But if that were to come, this principle is also true. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 10? In verse 28, he said, do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. Evidently, there was a real fear that Jesus' disciples may be killed. And so he told them, don't fear the people who can kill you physically. I don't think any of us want to sign up to go get killed. But Jesus said, don't fear the people that can do that. What you really need to be afraid of is losing your soul. That is really loss. And he said that's what you need to be afraid of. And he gave this example about these sparrows. And he said God's aware of all these things that are going on. You're all been out of shape about these things, but God's aware of it. And then he makes that famous statement about the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, you're of more value than many sparrows. So God knows what's going on, and he is well aware. And so God's with us. If we're serving him, we don't have to be frozen in fear of anybody because he's aware of what's going on. In Hebrews 13, beginning of verse 5, it says, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? I'm really encouraged by that. The Hebrew writer's attitude was, there's nothing man can do to me. If I'm serving God, then nothing else matters. Nobody can take anything away from me. And so that's the attitude we ought to have, even in the middle of difficulty. So fear can be paralyzing. The second thing that I think we learn from the story there is there's a worthy cause. In the story of David and Goliath, we learn that there's a worthy cause. We talked briefly about how David's older brother heard David asking, why isn't anybody going out to fight Goliath? He kind of went down there and his brother just thought he was being nosy to see what was going on. And David was kind of poking around. And you can picture that. You've got older brothers and you've got your little teenager brother coming over here and he's asking what's going on. Why is nobody going to go fight Goliath? And you can picture as an older brother maybe saying, why don't you go back home? You ain't got any business being down here. You don't know anything about what we've got going on. You're just all in our way. In 1 Samuel 17:28, that's pretty much what happened. Eliab, his older brother, heard when he spoke to the men. Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. He sort of makes fun of him. Don't you have some sheep to take care of or something? We're down here doing real work. We've got real business going on. And who'd you leave the sheep with? However, David was determined to serve God. As the verses go on, it said, David said, what have I done now? And here's that phrase. Is there not a cause? Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first ones did. Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. Then David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. David said, there's a cause here. There's a great cause. And this fellow's out here defying the armies of God. And you all are standing around like nothing's going on. And so I have a cause to be here. I really like that phrase. And that's why I wanted to title the lesson by that question. Is there not a cause? Because there was a great cause. David saw it. The others were too afraid to see it, I suppose. But everybody he talked to seemed to be so afraid they weren't going to do anything. All right, so what's the application for us today? Again, Goliath's not standing out there challenging us. But today there's a battle that's raging, and the battle's raging for your soul and mine. There's a worthy cause, and so we must be strong to defend our enemy. Our enemy is the devil, and all of his schemes and all of his plans are working. A lot of people are falling for them. The world is going astray, and we see things in the world, and it troubles us. And it seems like things are getting worse. But there's a cause to fight for. It'd be easy just to sort of crumble and say, we're not going to do anything. I'm too afraid to stand up or do anything, especially in today's day of age of political correctness and cancel culture and all these things. If I stand up and say anything or do anything, I'll be canceled and, I'll be thrown under the jail. But there was a cause then, there's a cause now. When you think about well-known battles and heroes throughout time, I was trying to find a good example. I was looking last night. There's been a lot of heroes and battles that have taken place. And you read this story about this person who, against all odds, pushed forward and they did some great things and they led people toward a victory. In all of those cases, though, that you can think of maybe in your mind of heroes throughout time, people became heroes because they leaned into the cause and they didn't give up fighting. They knew what they were fighting for, whether that's freedom or whatever it was. They leaned into the cause and that helped them to go fight. So David was rallying everyone. He was telling them there's a reason to fight. He said there's a cause. Today we've got a reason to stand up against evil. In Ephesians 6 and verse 10, you know these verses well, Paul said, "Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might. Put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." He said, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Therefore take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand." So a couple times here, he says, put on the armor of God, therefore take up the armor of God. In that language that Paul used, there's no doubt that Paul's talking about there is a fight going on. Are you in the fight or are you not? And he was encouraging brethren to put on the armor of God and let's go, let's fight. Because there are enemies that are troubling God's people today, as has always been in times past, and there's always a cause for the faithful to fight. Now our fight may not be like in David's day. We may not be out here on opposing hills waiting for somebody to come into the valley to challenge us. But there's a fight going on nonetheless. In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 12, Paul told Timothy, "Fight the good fight of faith, lay hold on eternal life, to which you are also called and have confessed the good confession in the presence of many witnesses." Fight the good fight of faith. Again, there's that terminology, like as of a battle. What about Jude, verses 3 and 4? "Beloved, while I was diligent to write to you concerning our common salvation, I found it necessary to write to you, exhorting you to contend earnestly for the faith, which was once for all delivered to the saints." So we usually just reference verse 3. Jude's point was, you got to contend for the faith. Why? Well, because there's a cause. And he goes on to say, "For certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for this condemnation, ungodly men, who turn the grace of our God into lewdness and deny the only Lord God and our Lord Jesus Christ." So I think these couple verses are interesting. Verse 3 says you ought to fight for the faith. And verse 4 tells the cause. There's a cause because people are turning against God. They're fighting against the Lord Jesus Christ. So you need to contend earnestly. So why contend for the faith? Well, because there's a cause. We've got reason to be involved in the conflict. And so that should motivate us to work, really. As we look around and see things not going well, that should cause us to be more motivated. Not cause us to have fear and be paralyzed, but it should cause us to lean into God's work and try to do great things for Him. And so rather than doing nothing because of fear, join the cause, because there is a worthy cause. There's a quote that I like, and I actually looked up last night. Don't even know where it originated from. The person that's always attributed to, they said he actually didn't say it. But at any rate, this quote is one that I like. And it says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Isn't that true? Isn't that so true? If we do nothing, then evil will continue advancing its cause. Evil is in the world today. There's a lot of evil going on, and we don't have to look very far to see it. But if we do nothing, then it'll just continue unhindered. There's a worthy cause. The last point I'd like to make is that faith is the victory. Faith is always the key in winning spiritual battles. We talked about how David trusted in God. You know, the battle that David won wasn't because David was so big. David didn't win because he was so strong. David didn't win even because he was really good with a sling, which I'm sure that he was. The battle was won because he had faith in God, and he demonstrated that. You could tell it. You could tell it by some of the things that he said, by some of the things that he did. Notice what he said to Saul in 1 Samuel 17, verse 37. Moreover, David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." So the Lord will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David didn't take any of the praise. He didn't say how great he was and I'm going to deliver this victory. I know how good I am and my abilities. That wasn't his attitude. His attitude was, I'm on God's side here. And so just like in the past with this Philistine, God is going to deliver me from the hand of this great giant Goliath. And that's exactly what happened. In the same way, the strength of our faith in God gives us the ability to win our battles. And so we're not here to say, you're so strong and you're so good and we're such great fighters and everything will be okay because you're so wonderful. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that if we put our trust in God, if we put our faith in Him, then God will give us the ability to win our battles. And He's provided us with a lot of tools to do that. Really, anything we can do to strengthen our faith should be our purpose in life. Praying, studying, assembling, like we are this morning, all that helps to make us stronger, and that helps us to be better prepared for the fight. In 1 John chapter 5, it says, "For whatever is," beginning of verse 4, "whatever is born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith." Our faith. Who is he who overcomes the world but he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? So faith is the victory that overcomes the world. We sing that song sometimes. Faith is the victory. So we have victory, but it comes through our faith, not because of any great thing that we have done or can do. Faith in God is the victory. Whatever is born of God overcomes the world. That's what we want to do. The victory is through faith. All right. So we asked the question today, is there not a cause? There's a cause. It's the cause of God. We got to recognize, though, that fear can be paralyzing. Fear can cause us to not act. But we've got to understand that the worthy cause is the cause of Christ. There's nothing more important to fight for, and so that should cause us to want to lean into that and understand that faith is the victory. It's not because of us. It'll be because of God. And so sort of in conclusion, just thinking about these things, in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 47, notice here it says, this is David talking. He says, "All this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear." It said, "For the battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands." This is David telling Goliath, the battle here is the Lord's. And God's going to cause this victory here. And he told Goliath, you're going to lose because you're standing up against God. God owns the battle is the point that I'm making. He's got the winning recipe. And so if you trust and obey God, He'll save you. He'll take care of you. In the reading that was done that Logan did for us in Romans 8, I just picked out this one verse out of that. But Paul said, "Yet in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us." Through Christ we're more than conquerors. I mean, you want to be a winner, you want to be victorious in the spiritual battle, well, God's going to win. And if we put our trust in Him, that's the only way that we can win. That's the only way we will win. All right, appreciate your attention today. Hopefully that was just a reminder about some of the familiar story of David and Goliath. It's a really neat story. But I think there's some real lessons that we can learn from that story as well. And talking about these things and talking about victory and talking about fighting, and we talked about how we're more than conquerors through Christ. That's true for all those who are God's children. But if you're not a Christian, you don't have hope to be on the winning side. If you're not on God's side, you will for sure lose in the long run. And that's just how it will be. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you're not a Christian, would you turn to God in faith? Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? If you do, you can stand before us this morning and make that confession. And you can turn away from your sins by repenting and being determined not to live in them any longer. And then you can be baptized, rising to walk in newness of life, and you'd then be a soldier in God's army fighting for His cause. You'd be in a good standing with God, and you'd be fighting for the winning team. The cause to serve God in order to gain eternity would be your goal then. Maybe you're already a Christian, but you've not been faithful to God, and you can make that situation right today as well. And so if you have a need, come forward while we stand and while we sing.